why I'm getting nostalgic for the 2000s. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Something a little bit different this week, and something that's been kind of percolating for me for the last couple of years, really. I found myself revisiting a lot of 2000s stuff and getting quite nostalgic for that decade. And that's odd because if you know me, I've never really been that big on the 2000s. You know, I'm a big 80s guy, especially 80s movies. And I'm a big 90s guy, movies and TV. 2000s was when I've always kind of thought pop culture started to go on the wane for me a little bit. Especially, and I have to admit, I'm still not big on 2000s movies. Obviously, that doesn't include everything. I do have favourites from the 2000s, like off the top of my head, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Let the Right One In, Wreck, Debs, Severance, Serendipity. But I do still feel that the 2000s were where we stopped getting as many great movies as we did in previous decades. But I have to admit, TV in the 2000s, I think I've underrated that quite a lot. Now, when you look back at the start of the 2000s, obviously, for quite a long time, there were TV shows that were 90s shows, and yet they're just as much 2000s shows as they are 90s shows. I mean, Buffy, for example, kind of grates my cheese these days when I hear Buffy referred to as a 90s show, because it was just as much a 2000s show as a 90s one. In fact, if you look at it, there's actually more of Buffy in the 2000s than there was in the 90s, because there's basically about 3.5 seasons each, because in America, you had half of the season 4 in 99 and then the second half of season 4 in 2000. But when you look at it, season 1 was obviously a shorter season than the rest of the 6 seasons. So in truth, there's actually more of Buffy in the 2000s than there is in the 90s. And there are some other hold-offs like X-Files and Ally and stuff like The Practice and Friends. I mean, they carried on for till 2004. That's pretty much halfway through the decade. And other shows that I've always long considered a favourite, like that 70s show. I mean, that really didn't start till late 98. That is way more of a 2000s show than a 90s show. So it's like, even in the first half of the decade, there's stuff that's kind of a holdover. These include a lot of my personal favourites. Now, I think there were reasons why I've kind of somewhat overlooked or underrated the 2000s. On a personal level, it was not a good decade for me. The 2010s were much better. The 2000s sucked, which I guess doesn't necessarily help. And I think there was a feeling of changing times, with a lot of those shows obviously ending in the early 2000s. And there were other things. I mean, the Bill debacle, that show basically turning into complete shite in 2002 after nearly 20 years of being a really good show, and then just turning into a ludicrous OTT soap opera aimed at morons. I can see why that might, colour my opinion. And reality television. I mean, the 2000s was the decade where reality television really started to swamp things, and I am not a fan of reality television. In fact, I can still remember, and I think it was like 1999, I can still remember reading in TV Week in Australia about this new show called Big Brother. And I remember reading that article and just being thoroughly nonplussed by it and thinking, who in God's name would want to watch shit like that? And within a few years, of course, shit like that was dominating the schedules. Okay, I guess I was completely out of it even back then. And of course, the 2000s, there was New Who. Now, and I know I'm not the biggest fan of New Who, and I'm not the biggest fan of the Davis era, and I guess maybe that's, one of the reasons why I'm not particularly keen on the 2000s as well. When what was your favourite show of all time comes back, and you kind of find after a couple of years that you don't really necessarily like it all that much anymore. I guess that can cause something of a perception that that was a crap decade as well. But like I've said, there's been a renaissance recently, and not just in terms of like giving credit to stuff that was, started in the 90s, but still carried on for quite a long time into the 2000s, like Buffy, Friends, That 70s Show, etc., etc. But the last few years, I'd say probably maybe the last 3 or 4 years, and particularly the last 2, I've been kind of revisiting, and in some cases reevaluating, and in some cases rediscovering, or even just discovering stuff from the 2000s that have given me kind of more affection for the decade. Now, I guess the first one would be about 3 or 4 years ago, would be Enterprise, or Star Trek Enterprise, if you prefer. Now, I never really bothered with Enterprise the first time, honestly, in the mid-2000s. I watched the pilot, and I remember thinking the pilot was pretty good. And then I think I watched like the next couple of episodes, and I went, and just kind of lost interest. And I don't think that was very fair. I mean, to be fair, those first couple of episodes after the pilot aren't necessarily the greatest. But I think a lot of it, and I think this has been said by other Star Trek fans, a lot of it was just kind of fatigue, I think, because, you were coming off of like 15 years worth of Next Generation and DS9 and Voyager, and it was like another Star Trek show that, despite some cosmetic differences, wasn't really all that different. And I can see why that, why that contributed to a sense of, oh, it's another one, But I have to say, rediscovering it 3 or 4 years ago, I bought the whole series on DVD, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really, really like Enterprise now. It may even be my favourite, although DS9 is still very much a sentimental favourite. But yeah, that was a big kind of discovery, really, because I never really saw most of it. And a couple of years ago, of course, I rediscovered a fandom that was a big part of like the mid-2000s, but was basically kind of disappeared. And that, of course, was being a fan of Canadian-Australian actress Bridget Novell, who was in Neighbours and Wicked Science, of course. And that, of course, was sparked by her brief return to Neighbours for 3 episodes in early 2020, which was the first time I'd watched anything of Neighbours in a very long time, and also the last. But it was enough to kind of remind me, oh, hey, I used to really like her. And it kind of led me to rediscover some of the stuff in the mid-2000s, like Wicked Science, for one thing. The problem with Wicked Science, I really enjoyed that show. I watched it for I watched the repeat run of season 1 and season 2, which ran through to like April 2006, and I really liked that show. But unfortunately, I made the mistake of not taping it and assuming that it was going to get a DVD release, and it fucking didn't. And it vanished. And unfortunately, so did the actress, because I didn't have any. She basically packed it up not long after. And unfortunately, I didn't have any of that. Because she was part of, as well as the very brief renaissance of Neighbours, a show that I'd stopped watching in the early 90s in kind of disgust. And they somehow managed to suck me back in again in early 2004. And then she came in it later on, of course, as Lana, and I kind of fell in love with her. And by the end of that season, I was a huge fan of the show again. Even I was still having to squint and pretend that what they'd done in the early 90s didn't happen. But I'm like, okay, this is looking like a real golden age to rival the 80s, And then it turned to shit again almost immediately after. Over the course of the next 18 months, 2005 and 2006, it turned to absolute shit again, and they basically threw away or actively crapped on everything that had drawn me back and made me a fan again. And I stopped watching again in complete disgust again. Like, well, thanks for that. And I think, that may be one of the reasons why I'd almost kind of forgotten that fandom. Partly it was down to lack of access, of course, because hadn't seen any of it for 14 sodding years. Didn't have any of Wicked Science. Didn't have any of the Neighbours 2004 stuff. And just that brief, reappearance in 2020 kind of sparked off. I used to really like her. I used to really like Wicked Science as well. Is that actually out on DVD yet? And of course it was, albeit only in Spain. And I managed to get them, and I somehow managed to get hold of, from internet contacts, the whole 2004 season of Neighbours as well. And I binged the hell out of those in 2020 and just absolutely loved them again. Now, I haven't seen them again since. I am planning on watching season 1 of Wicked Science again later this year. Next time around, I'm not going to be binging them quite as insanely as I did in 2020. But it was just kind of the kind of excitement of getting something back that used to mean a lot to me that I just kind of receded into the mists of time because of lack of access. But that was really, really, and I think as well as lack of access, there was this, not Wicked Science, but certainly with Neighbours, I think there was a certain degree of kind of resentment and kind of bitterness, really, and some anger. Because by the time you got to the end of the 2000s, because I didn't start my YouTube channel till 2008. So by that time, I'd already stopped freaking watching Neighbours nearly 2 years. And I hadn't seen Bridget in anything for nearly 2 years. By the time I was doing like top 10 shows of the 2000s or celebrating the 2000s music videos, which would have been early 2010, A, didn't have any access to it, and B, my residual impression of Neighbours was not how good the 2004 season was, but how freaking terrible the subsequent seasons were, and how much that disappointed and disgusted me, and kind of made me angry again, because it was like, it's like I'd given this show a second chance against my better judgment, and it fucked me over again. I rarely give shows a second chance, and so I felt like an idiot basically for doing so and then getting screwed over again. Never again. But now, of course, from the perspective of today, not only have I got Wicked Science back, but I've got that season back, and I can see why I liked that season. I can see why I kind of became a fan again. And that season is now fresher in my memory, because I only watched it again in 2020, less than 2 years ago, than all of the crappy stuff that put me off again. That's 15, 16 years ago now, and I'm never going to watch that fucking stuff again. So I can just appreciate the 2004 season more without having to be, embittered by that. Now, it's not just that. There's been other things recently from the 2000s that I've been revisiting. Stuff that were favourites in the 2000s, but which I haven't seen for a really long time. The two biggest ones being Lost and 24. Now, both of those shows were big deals for me in the 2000s. They were two of my favourite shows. They were two of the big shows of the decade, and I watched them all, and I thoroughly enjoyed them all. And then I don't know, I guess something kind of happened. I just stopped watching them. I think I watched them both, like, again. I watched them a second time. and then that was it. I think the last time that I watched Lost prior to last year was probably about 2012 when I rewatched season 6, which was the final season, and that was basically it. And I, again, I had access to those shows. I had both of those shows on DVD. It's not like, it's not like Wicked Science where I simply didn't have it and didn't have any access to it. I had them both on DVD. I just never revisited them at all. And then, like early last year, for some reason, I think it was like reactions videos on YouTube. I was kind of tempted to watch Lost again, and I basically binged the whole show again last year, and kind of fell in love with it again. It's like, oh yeah, it was good, this, wasn't it? I remember why I liked this show, and I've been doing the same with 24 lately. I'm actually rewatching season 4 at the moment. Again, I haven't seen that in must be over 10 years probably. So it's like what I find kind of amusing is because of this time thing, when it being quite a long time since you've seen them. When I did that like top 10 2000 shows music vid, the original one, which would have been 2010, there was no Wicked Science and there was no Neighbours. Now the Wicked Science thing again was probably because I didn't even have a fucking clip of it. There wasn't anything of it on YouTube at the time, and I didn't have it. And with Neighbours again, I was pretty pissed off by the way that show went. But Lost and 24 were in there. And yet when I redid that video in late 2020, I did a new version, completely new version of it, top 10 2000 shows. I put Wicked Science and Neighbours in there, but there was no Lost and 24 because it had been so long since I'd watched them. I'm almost tempted to do another version, but it seems a bit soon. It's not even 2 years. I might do another version in another couple of years. But I just think it's interesting that the 2000s it's one of those decades where things kind of, they've been forgotten and then rediscovered, and then been forgotten and then rediscovered. At least for me. I don't know. It's a very odd decade compared to the 90s. I think I've never really been nostalgic for the 90s because the 90s have never really been away for me. Because I had all the stuff in the 90s that I loved, like X-Files and Seinfeld and Buffy and the Star Treks. I basically had all of them on VHS for the most part. Even like DS9, I taped DS9 on VHS, and then I bought some of the later season VHSs, and then of course DVDs came along, and the 90s shows came out pretty damn quickly on DVD in the early 2000s. X-Files and Buffy and the Star Treks. And Seinfelds. They were pretty quick on DVD. So those shows have never really been away from me. Whereas a lot of the 2000s stuff, it was like saw it at the time, didn't see it for a long time after. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I kind of underrated the 2000s. And of course there was other stuff from the 2000s, getting into the late 2000s, or the mid to late. Dexter obviously carried on into the 2010s, but again, as with Buffy, it's pretty much like 50-50 between decades. And in the late 2000s, even though I didn't see them until the 2010s, they started about late 2008 in the US. You've got stuff like The Mentalist and Fringe, which is definitely one of a favorite. Again, I'm more kind of associate them with the 2010s, but they still started in the 2000s. So yeah, the last few years, probably starting 3 or 4 years ago with Enterprise, but certainly in the last couple of years since kind of rediscovering the Bridget fandom, I've really been kind of reassessing and reevaluating and appreciating the 2000s more, particularly 2000s TV. And I've found myself getting kind of nostalgic for it. I mean, one of the things that surprised me the most was when I was doing those year tribute videos, and even like some of the top 10 musical countdown vids, some of the ones I've enjoyed doing the absolute most were the 2000s one, and that really surprised me, because like I said, I've never been big on the 2000s, so it kind of surprised me how much I really enjoyed digging into those years for those videos. Yeah, I think, again, I'm still not, I still think it was the start of a downward turn for movies, but certainly with TV, I think I underappreciated the 2000s for a long time, and I'm just kind of starting the last few years to really rediscover it and appreciate it much more, maybe than I did at the time, but certainly than I have in the last 10, 12 years or so. So that's why I'm getting nostalgic for the 2000s.